What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are covering X-Men Black Magneto, the one-shot. And these are like a series of one-shots that lead to like the relaunch of Uncanny X-Men, right? These are really designed more for the purpose of really, one, kind of going back to like the old school standard for X-Men storytelling, and two, kind of preparing people for what to expect with Uncanny X-Men. And so because of the nature of that, it actually makes sense that Chris Claremont is writing the one-shot for Magneto, because again, Chris Claremont's well known as being like the X-Men writer. I mean, he wrote the damn comics for 17 years. But one thing to bear in mind when it comes to Chris Claremont and his whole X-Men run was that you had a really interesting situation in terms of how his stories would be told, right? Like, he focused a lot on character development. So now, usually what you get with stories is this like event after event after event after event, and that's really about it. The Chris Claremont era of storytelling is really reminiscent of a bygone age. And so it's really just like action-packed events nonstop. So take, for example, like when he first took up the X-Men, right? And he wrote like the Phoenix Saga. Well, that runs with 97 or 98 all the way up to 100 and something, like 107 or something along those lines. And then you get like 20 or 30 issues, and then you go into Dark Phoenix, and then you get like another, I don't know, like 5 or 6 issues, and then you get Days of Future Past. So it was one of those things where like you would have event after event, but it would be interspersed or really separated and kind of sandwiched between a huge amount of storytelling when it came to the characters. And it was a way for Chris Claremont to shift the X-Men away from being just a team that fought things to being like a dynamic team where everybody had their own individual distinct personalities, a soap opera, if you will. And so what this does is it initially picks up with Magneto. Now, in reality, the comic's a little preachy, but with regards to like Magneto's character, it is cool because it gives you kind of a throwback to something akin to the way Chris Claremont wrote. But this initially picks up with Magneto inside the Gold Star Cafe. And this is just kind of a cafe that he happened to spot as he was walking along, and he's met by a young girl named Kate. Now, this is a cool discussion they have because as the two of them are talking, they begin to sort of talk about the nature of like the diner that they're in. And Kate talks about her mom, about how her mom went off. She was basically deployed. And it's kind of a cool thing because what Kate ends up noticing is the numerical brand that's on Magneto's arm. And it's kind of crazy because he tries to shy away. He tries to move away from it all. But one of the things that's also interesting here is like the old versus the new. And it's almost kind of like a stand-in for the way comics are, right? I mean, we talked about that in the beginning, that you had old school standard of storytelling where it was very, very long and very, very drawn out. In reality, if Chris Claremont started writing the Uncanny X-Men now, the way he wrote them back then, a lot of people would probably get bored. People are moving at like a mile a minute now, and they want their stories like super fast paced. But with this discussion kind of isolated as it is, Magneto talks about how he reads books, right? He just likes reading physical books, whereas this girl Kate, she likes reading things on digital. And it's just kind of like, well, times have changed, old man. It's not the way that it used to be. Things are totally different now. But from here, we end up having Kate again recognize this brand, this numerical brand on Magneto's arm. And this is when he says he got it when he was in Auschwitz. Now, the other half here is that Kate really talks about this diner as being intrinsically tied into the nature of her family's history. Now, given the complexion of Kate, we could kind of go either way, that she's possibly African-American, but given the way her hair is drawn, it looks like she's Jewish. And the store itself, the cafe itself being called the Gold Star is reminiscent of the role of Jews, or at least a position they were put in by Germans in concentration camps. And what I mean by that is, in truth, during World War II, the Jews were required to wear yellow stars. They weren't really gold, but it is the idea that like it's predicated on remembering their history, remembering their past. And so it is a pretty important thing. And it really seemed to be one of the reasons why Magneto hit on it. So it really seems to be tied to the Jewish history in the sense that it's called the Gold Star Cafe. That rings a bell with Magneto himself, and it does it in a couple different ways. Marvel has over the years, if you go back and read like classic X-Men, 110, 111, 114, you do get some history of Magneto there. But I would say the most comprehensive origin story for Magneto himself came during the Testament story, or I guess really the Testament miniseries that was done by Greg Pak. And that focused very heavily on Magneto in his youth when he was in Auschwitz. And it built on all that stuff that came after in terms of him going on to form a life by himself, meeting Magda and so on and so forth, the two of them getting married and so on and so forth. And so that's why things like this, little tidbits like this, are really cool, because if you've followed X-Men as long as I have, you see these small little tidbits, these small little things that are thrown in that really kind of remind you of Magneto. For example, how he relates to Kate is very reminiscent of when he took over the X-Men and he was leader of the New Mutants. And so it's awesome to sort of see those small little things kind of coming home to roost, and seeing Chris Claremont finally coming home to a title that he worked so hard on and made so spectacular, because in reality, everything you know and love about the X-Men is all due to Chris Claremont. That's it. It really all rests on his shoulders. But from here, we end up getting this televised news broadcast that picks up on the Office of National Emergency, ONE, and the idea that they've basically begun the process of creating like camps around the entire country where mutants are going to be stationed. Now, that's always been an on-running theme when it comes to the mutant population of Marvel Comics. It's one of the reasons why mutants were always a great allegory for like any particular oppressed group. For the fact that they are mutants, because of the fact that they're the next stage in human evolution, it means that they're constantly forced into internment, or they're constantly put down upon, or they're constantly segregated, or something along those lines. But what the Office of National Emergency is doing is really moving in the direction of the most feared process for mutants, which is to say the coming of days of future past. That eventually something will happen, a tipping point will take place, and mutants will be subjugated by humanity. And it really kind of strikes a chord, because for Magneto, he's lived through this. He lived in a society where these people here are undesirable. Therefore, we need to inter them, we need to throw them in jail, and we need to keep them away from everybody else. Magneto's lived through that. For Kate, she hasn't. For this young girl, she's never lived through any of that stuff. And Magneto kind of feeds on that a bit and kind of says, yeah, it's absolutely terrifying. Because what happens when they start going for everybody? When it stops being mutants and then it starts being people based on skin color. Now, of course, this leads directly into a handful of people at the bar basically stepping up and, kind of doing their thing. You're different from us, we don't like you, and Magneto kind of lets it go. Now, this is one of the things that Claremont's really kind of hitting at here. Magneto over the years has changed, and that's really what Claremont's doing in this particular part of the story. Because if this was Magneto from like 1977 or from like 1983, he would have just killed him. This is one of those things where it just kind of comes with wisdom. If Magneto lashed out and killed these guys, he would attract unwanted attention and possibly even rain down havoc on the Gold Star Cafe and bring them a whole bunch of undue hardship. And if they're mutants, if anybody in the Gold Star Cafe are mutants, then whisk them away. But for Kate herself, she's actually not, because where she steps in and she tells everybody, you guys have to calm down, you guys have to stop. She shows them the brand on Magneto's arm saying, this guy was in a concentration camp. This guy knows what this situation is like. You guys are just kind of sitting on your high horses and you're ranting and raving about the return of something that you don't know anything about, but they don't really know what they're asking for. What they're asking for comes from knowledge of like documentaries and textbooks. They didn't live through it. That's one of the funny things about humanity in the comics is when you look at humanity versus mutants, it's one of those things where humanity's like, yeah, everything's fine so long as it's only the mutants who are being dealt with. And so it's kind of a funny scenario when you see these diametrically opposing groups, sort of facing off against each other. And so what this does is it leads into Magneto going through kind of a training process here. And this is cool because where he's on Asteroid M, this training process he endures is a way for him to basically hone his skills. He's using his abilities to face off against the X-Men consistently in terms of these simulated events, these simulated training sessions, and does it with the safety protocols off, meaning it's entirely possible he may get himself killed doing this. But for Magneto, it's worth it because we've seen how strong he can be against the X-Men and how formidable of an enemy he can be. But what he ends up doing is basically launching an attack on one of the facilities, traveling directly to, San Fernando in Texas, intending to liberate people. Now, this is a throwback to the old way of Magneto. Way back in the early days when he was more extreme, he would have just shown up here and just wiped everything out. And it just been like everybody's dead. Issue an EMP and all the soldiers are dead and all that kind of stuff. Take him out, do whatever he needs to do, and then save the mutants. Instead, he's a lot more reserved now. And so he shows up here and basically says they would expect like a vehicle to come flying up here, not some man who could be a reporter or any number of things. And so he begins to face off against one of these Sentinels. The Sentinels themselves are designed for the purpose of facing off against Magneto, given the fact that he has magnetic powers. But what they assume is that Magneto's gotten weaker over the years, that Magneto's nowhere near as powerful as he used to be. And what he basically says is that's not true. He's essentially just kind of like tricking them into believing he's a lot weaker than he is. So they'll essentially let their guard down, because what would happen here is you would have this Sentinel, this man Sentinel that would show up to fight Magneto. The Sentinel would obviously get the upper hand, and then everybody inside the base would just kind of be like, the Sentinel will take care of him, just let everything else go. And in that moment, Magneto would basically take out the Sentinel and strike. And that's exactly what he does. He ends up dismantling the Sentinel in its entirety, like the metal, the physical form, the whole 9 yards, breaks it apart in pieces, and then in turn is exposed to this woman who looks like she's Kate's mom, or at least somebody similar to that. And this girl's like, I'm 100% right that you're the wrong kind of people. And that's where the whole argument comes down to. It's that mutants are good, mutants are people, they're just not the right kind of people. And because they're not the right kind of people, we have to contain them and we have to control them. That's the nature of humans versus mutants in Marvel Comics. And so in this moment, Magneto kind of realizes there may be no saving this girl. Like, she may very well be beyond beyond any real measure of redemption, but he ends up letting her live anyway, which is a little strange. What he does is literally take out the entire electronic system in the building, issues an EMP, basically tells her, look, I'm liberating all these mutants here. If you come after me, I will kill you. And so it's really kind of a warning. And so this kind of goes really a lot into like the old Sanctuary stories from the X-Men comics, where Magneto, flew around and liberated all these mutant camps and then took the mutants into space and just kind of lived there and so on. It's a pretty cool bit of storytelling. And so grabbing these mutants and then liberating them and then basically walking away, it means that it gives him the chance to regroup, to kind of reform his army. But one of the things that he says here, this is why it's so important. One of the things that he says here is that he's barely begun to tap into his power, that he's barely begun to tap into his true potential and what he's truly capable of. Now, this is Chris Claremont writing this, and this is technically a one-shot. What this indicates is that one, Magneto's a lot more powerful than he's letting on. Two, Magneto himself doesn't really even know the upper limits of his powers. And three, his upper limits may be something just outrageously powerful. Because when you're talking about controlling magnetism and controlling metal and so on and so forth, you're talking about controlling the molecular structure of things, the electron bonds between objects. And so when you're talking about controlling that, you're controlling the fundamental forces of the universe. Now, whether or not this would go in the direction of Magneto becoming God, I don't really know. At the end of the day, reality manipulation is reality manipulation is reality manipulation, and it doesn't really matter how you do it, it's a matter of how it's written. And so, if Magneto reached that point where he could control like the atomic structure of matter by using magnetism itself, he'd be no different than somebody like Franklin Richards. It's just the means by which he does it. So it is kind of cool to see how this whole thing unfolds and how this whole thing happens. There is also Degeneration which deals with Apocalypse. We're going to cover that later because this is actually a 5-part backup feature, which actually looks really, really cool. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.